Well, spring has sprung in Canadian cities, and with the sound of a robin in the park, pastors in urban centers are also familiar with how the streets come to life once the chill is gone. And as things warm up and head into the summer, we often see that the hotter it gets, sometimes the more troubled people without good air conditioning will get as well. This is a new Quest conversation starting today, and we are featuring the letter U, which stands for urban churches. We've assembled a panel of pastors, men and women from St. John, New Brunswick to Vancouver, BC, and each of them are going to share some of their insights and experiences that come from being a pastor in the urban core. That is a uniquely different experience than pastoring anywhere else. While there are many unique challenges to urban life, there are also many unique attractions, and you're going to hear about some of that. You know, people are learning in the urban core how to live slowly in the frantic pace of city life. And certainly pastoring people requires us to be centered. It requires us not to be consumed by the rapid pace that's going on around us. So we're going to share in these conversations also about how we're building community partnerships, ways that we are engaging with our parish, our neighborhoods, and learning from each other. You know, one thing I've noted about urban churches, the key to their success often is their ability to collaborate with community partnerships and partner with the body of Christ. We've got some incredible pastors coming up. Let's go to that interview right now. Welcome to Sidewalk Skyline podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Rogers. This podcast is an exploration of God at work in Canadian cities. And we're in a 5-month series that I call Quest Conversations. In these episodes, we're exploring various models of urban ministry in Canadian cities. So what are the letters of Quest an acronym for? Q, qualitative neighboring. U, urban church. E, energizers. S, street ministry engagement. And T, transformers. So as we're going along in these conversations, we're going to focus on one of those letters. Today's episode is brought to you by the letter U, which stands for urban church. So what do we mean by urban church? Our working definition of urban includes high density, meaning that we live in areas that are densely populated. High diversity, meaning that there is a great range in terms of culture and subculture. And high disparity, the haves and the have-nots coexisting in the same geography. That's what we mean when we say urban. And today we're talking with pastors of urban churches from coast to coast. Each urban center is so different from the other, but we're finding lots of common ground in what it means to be an urban congregation. So we're going to introduce our guests for today. The first one is we're going to go left to right from British Columbia to New Brunswick. So starting on the left, Simon Gao is on staff at Broadway Church in Vancouver, BC. He serves as the community pastor and the executive director of Cityreach. Tell us about yourself, Simon, and take us on a 5 senses tour of the neighborhood that your church is in. What's it like, and who might we meet on the street around Broadway?
Thanks, Kevin. Vancouver is a fascinating place, and most people probably have heard 2 things about Vancouver: that we have a high cost of living and we have lots of rain. And I just wanted to let you know, okay, we don't have as much rain as everyone says we do. But the high cost of living is true. It's expensive to live here, and that might lead to some of the disparity that you were mentioning. Here in Vancouver, we are very densely populated. We're actually the densest populated city in all of Canada. And so according to Tim Keller, we have the most image of God per square inch right here in Vancouver, which means the opportunity is so great. In just a 3-kilometer radius of our church building, we have 36 elementary schools and 6 high schools. And so people are packed in this small area in East Vancouver where we are. And they are multicultural, very diverse. We have refugees and immigrants and migrants. 48% of the people that live just around our neighborhood here were born outside of Canada. And I'm pretty sure the other half are just from other cities in Canada that have come to live here in Vancouver. I was born and raised here, and so I tell people that I'm a Vancouver unicorn because people are surprised to meet someone who's actually from here. The area that we minister to and how our community looks, we serve a very low income area, and there's a 45% of the annual income in our area is less than $60,000 a year. So we have a group of people that we're serving here that are predominantly not from here and are on, dealing with issues of vulnerability and poverty as well.
Thanks. We're glad to meet you, Simon. And Vancouver truly is a wonderful place. We have a guest that will be joining us in a few minutes from Edmonton, but let's skip a couple provinces over to Manitoba and meet Bruce Martin. He's the pastor of the historic Calvary Temple in Winnipeg, another congregation that over the years has remained in the city core rather than moving out. So welcome, Bruce. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Calvary Temple.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for having me share about Winnipeg. This is a wonderful city, of course, and I went for a walk this morning and did the Portage in Maine, coldest place on the country of Canada corner, and it was a bit cold this morning actually, and we're going to have some real winter here in a few days. So I've been pastoring here for 23 years. I think that to talk about Calvary Temple and the fact that we're still in the downtown core, I would need to honor my predecessor, H.H. Barber, who just passed away a few months ago. And he used to say this, I've heard him say it many, many times. If you're really serious about reaching your whole city, then you only have one option. You have to be downtown. And what he meant by that was that 10 to 20% of the people who live in this core, who come to our church, could not get anywhere else on a Sunday morning when public transit doesn't run. So that's why the decisions in the 60s and 70s and 80s that this congregation made to stay here gives us an opportunity to be ministering in the most diverse place you could imagine. We have 70 different birth nations of people within our congregation. They come from all over the world, and we have a lot of ministry connected. We call them fellowships from various places, West Indies and African and French, and we also have a hard of hearing congregation, our deaf ministry, and so we have a lot of ministries that reach to a lot of people. So I'll tell you more about that later, but I'm so glad to be here and to be able to represent a really neat church. My wife and I, 23 and a half years, we love it. It's part of us. It's become really the call of a lifetime for us. We are so honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing with all of you today.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think, is Anna Morganti part of your church there in Winnipeg?
Very much so.
Yeah. I'm the urban ministries consultant with Mission Canada, and Anna is one of our urban workers. And I hear nothing but good reports. And one day we'll probably have to have Anna
Yeah,
on the podcast as well. I'm sure she's got a story to tell.
she has a story to tell, let me tell you.
Yeah. Well, let's go across the prairies and land at YYZ, Pearson International Airport in Toronto. And we're going to rent a car. We're going to drive 20 kilometers northeast to the Jane Finch corridor. Olu Jegede is the senior pastor of Christian Center Church. And you can hear Olu in season 1, episode 8, and in one of our series on gangland preachers. So tell us a bit about yourself, Olu, and Christian Center Church.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for this opportunity. So Jane and Finch is a very, very wonderful community. I guess I should say a little bit about our church first. So I'm the lead pastor at Christian Center Church, located in the Jane and Finch community of Northwest Toronto, North York. And it's called Jane and Finch because of the intersections of the streets Jane and Finch. And so our church is a very diverse church, right in the heart of the community. So we pastor here, me and my wife Jennifer. I've been on staff here for about 20 years. Since I was the youth pastor and now the lead pastor. So it's just been an amazing journey. I came as a student. York University is about 1 kilometer just east of us. And so there you have just the disparity that you talked about, because our community is a struggling community. We have lots of single family homes, lots of people who haven't finished high school or college, and lots of unemployment as well. We have high stats in terms of the teenage pregnancies and so forth. So just plagued with tons of just negative social statistics. And then of course you have the disparity. You have York University that has about 50,000 students and just really amazing buildings and obviously great facilities. And also then around us, another half a kilometer away, you have wonderful homes, $1 million homes, $800,000 homes. And then you have the Jane and Finch streets as well, where you have rows and rows of townhouses, low-income apartment buildings, and you just see the stark disparity. So I tell people, you want to go on missions and you feel like the only course or recourse you have is to go to the ends of the earth. Maybe not. God might be calling you to come into the urban community, because when you enter the Jane and Finch community, it's like you've left Toronto almost, because all of a sudden now you see the nations of the world. You see tons of different ethnicities, and really it feels like, again, like you're in the other parts of the world that you would have to fly to. So we love being here. We serve here with our 4 children and with wonderful, wonderful staff. And we're just praying for God's heart in this community and in our city of Toronto.
Wonderful. Let's get back on our private jet. You know, urban pastors usually are the wealthier of pastors, not. But we're going to fly now to Montreal. And Kivens Amadi is the pastor of Église Gospel Vie, a multicultural church located in the heart of Montreal's South Central District. Bonjour, Kivens. And now for my high school French question. Parlez-nous de vous et de l'église que vous pasteur.
Bonjour, Kevin. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm Kevin. So our names are quite the same.
Yes.
I've been pastoring Gospel V Church for over 4 years now. Actually, that's where I got married 20 years ago with my wife. I started there as a youth leader, and then I became a deacon. I was preaching at that church. I left for about 2 years to join the pastoral team of another church in Montreal, and then came back to become the lead pastor. I work with a wonderful team. It's a church that has people coming from different parts of Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, also, and of course, Quebec. And we are also neighbors to, it's an eclectic neighborhood because we are neighbors to the major TV networks of Montreal. The gay village of Montreal also is right next to, literally next to the church. We also have the university student community there. So we have so many different people coming from all over the place. And when we get together, we have a blast. It's an honor to pastor this church.
Now we're going to go to the Maritimes, and Chad Nickerson is at Calvary Temple in St. John, New Brunswick, an uptown church. And you can hear a full interview with Chad in season 1, episode 7. So Chad, for those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Calvary Temple.
Sure. I'm a Maritimer born and raised, originally from Nova Scotia, and pastored in Nova Scotia, and now pastor in St. John, New Brunswick. We call it the Uptown due to the historical roots of our community here, but we serve in the inner core of the small city of St. John, New Brunswick. And we're at this church, have worked here in a variety of capacities for 16 years. And our goal is to reach people with the grace and love and truth of God. We're in an area that has significant challenges when it comes to child poverty, when it comes to unemployment, and some very, very serious difficulties that in some ways, unfortunately, lead our nation with some of the very raw needs that are found here. And so we find ourselves in this place to serve and help. The congregation has made decisions to stay in the inner city when many other congregations within even a block or two have had to close or had to move. And we've made the choice to stay here, to continue to serve, to share, to care. And it is a challenge, but it is as well very rewarding to be able to be here and get to know the folks that stay here in the inner core. And we're excited to see some urban renewal that's happening in our neighborhood and in our community. And even that brings some other sets of challenges that we're beginning to discover and experience. But we are glad to be able to be here to represent Jesus and help those who want to connect with us and be able to grow in the love of the Lord.
In Simon, in his introduction to us, he referred to a quote from Tim Keller. Cities quite literally have more of the image of God per square inch than any other place on earth. How can we not be drawn to such masses of humanity if we care about the same things that God cares about? Now, Tim Keller is referring to that urban property of dense population. And but what are some of the reasons that you think people avoid ministry in the city core or in the places that you are? Not every pastor would feel that sense of, yeah, I want to be right in the heart of the city. They would prefer to live somewhere else. So talk a bit about that. What are some reasons that people might avoid ministering or living in the core of the city? Anybody just unmute, pipe in? Go ahead, Kivens.
Yes, I'll say that, first of all, I was raised and born in the city. Okay, city for me is home. That's where I feel good. I love to see people, crowds, even the noise of the city to me is really appealing. But I think a lot of people associate city with violence, some negative experiences, greed. And people tend to want to stay away from these things, even when we want to do ministry, sometimes we have an idea of ministry that that doesn't necessarily pushes us toward violence or danger, right? So city is where a lot of people think that if you're going to have a hard time, that's where it's going to happen. So, but it's not necessarily the experience that, every one of us is going to have. Some people will have, great opportunities and great experiences ministering to the cities.
Yeah, anybody else? What do you find people's ideas are about city life that you would know differently?
Honestly, ministry within an urban context in a city, it can be messy, it can be expensive, it can be raw and real, and even just dealing with just the simple logistic of a language barrier is huge within the city, because over half of our in our context, 51% of the people that live in our neighborhood, English isn't their first language. And so all these factors together, it adds another element of trying to do effective ministry within a city when we're maybe used to, or it's easier for us to operate in a different way.
Simon, you're a BC unicorn, a Vancouver unicorn. So have you ever lived outside of city life?
Yeah, no, this is all I've known. You know what? I was raised in kind of what maybe we would call the suburbs, kind of Vancouver next to, I guess. So I have a little experience in the urban setting, in like the suburbs versus like the actual like downtown city core, like we just heard about. But one of the biggest things I've noticed from moving from just slightly, 30 minutes away from downtown core city to this suburbia, if you can call it that, people in the city are eclectic. Like there's just like every type of person from every walk of life, and there's an eclecticness to city living that you don't find as much in the burbs.
I think there can be an exaggerated social dynamic in the city core sometimes, where people find the place where they can be themselves and where they find other people like them. And yeah, that's an interesting observation. It's one of our broad strokes, of course. But what about those of you who grew up outside of a city, now finding yourself in this very urban context? What was it that attracted you to life in the city? Or did you come kicking and screaming and discover that it was actually a good place? Chad Nickerson.
I totally came kicking and screaming. I always said I would never live in a city. I'm a country boy, and yet here I am, and here I still am. And it's God. God draws us. God calls us, and He opens doors and opportunities that He wants to grow us through. It can be very different in an urban setting. A lot of the tools from our toolkit that maybe we know from ministry from a suburban setting or a rural setting, some of those just don't work in an urban environment. And so that can be difficult, but I really want to help people and serve people and respect people and meet them where they are. And those things are really the same anywhere you go, I guess. And so I've grown and been learning a lot as through kicking and screaming, have got to this point.
It's interesting, the small town pastor versus the urban pastor. One thing that sometimes happens is that when a small town pastor transitions to living in the city, working in the city, that they actually do quite well because of the fragmentation in cities. The large metropolitan cities have very distinctive neighborhoods. They have people that live in and work in that neighborhood, and you know, they may move from one neighborhood to another, but there's such a centralized identity attached to each neighborhood. And so sometimes a small town pastor can find that in that parish context of, okay, I'm in the, you know, that neighborhood of the city, they can get a hold of that easier than they can get a hold of the concept of, I've got 1 million people to minister to. People out who don't live in the city, sometimes they look at the city life and they think it's so frantic, it's so fast paced, I couldn't handle the traffic, that everything's changing all the time. And those are certainly urban realities. But I find that the people that thrive and do well in the city life often have learned practices that help them to slow down and to rest and to carve out space for personal renewal. So, how are you learning to live slow in a geography that puts so many demands on your time and keeps you constantly busy? Who's mastered the Sabbath here? Anybody? You want to talk about that?
Sure, I could jump in on this one, Kevin. So when we moved, well, when we first got into ministry and things started to get busy, my wife and I decided that we would take the one day as a Sabbath together. And for a period of time, she was working, and then she started to stay home with the kids, and I was working. So we took the one day that was my day off as a Sabbath, and that was amazing because it was like a vacation every week. We would not take any calls. We would plan little things for the kids. And as the kids grew up, they realized that that was a sacred thing that we did. And we would even have our date nights in the evening at kind of at the end of the Sabbath. So it was beautiful. It brought life. I think the other thing that I was thinking also in terms of how do we still, keep our sanity was we just try to keep things simple. So there's a period of time where we decided that we were not going to drive. We had a car. It was actually fairly brand new. But because of the fragmentation that you're speaking, we realized that now that we were living right in the inner city, we didn't need our car a lot. The grocery store was across the road. The church was across the road. The kids' school was behind, our home. And we, for a whole month, we did not drive. And so we just realized that, keeping your life simple allows you to really hear God distill things slower through the rhythms of life. And it just brought more rest. And so that's just one or two things that I wanted to add there.
Well, speaking of frantic life in the city and interruptions and all that, one of the guests that we didn't get to introduce yet was called out for a moment from the meeting just after we started recording the podcast. So welcome back, Debbie. And Debbie Kunst is the senior pastor of Edmonton's Father's House. And if you go back to season 1, episode 19, Spiritual Mother in the Father's House, you can hear a lot more about the work that Debbie is involved in Edmonton, downtown Edmonton. So welcome back, Debbie, and give us a brief introduction to yourself and Father's House.
Thanks, Kevin. I apologize for leaving, but here at Father's House, life has not gotten quieter. We stayed busy completely through all the months of COVID. And in fact, so many praise reports of how God's been supplying for us here in Edmonton. And I left briefly because someone came with a donation that had wanted to see me and speak to me. And I think it's important to be able to thank people personally. So I did step away. Here in Edmonton, it's winter time, and so everything that we do has great meaning for people who are on the streets. Edmonton Father's House is right in Chinatown, actually, 97th Street in Edmonton. It's an old part of the city. We are in a very old building that was initially, I think, began in 1946, the old Ukrainian Pentecostal temple. We actually took over that building and bought it to plant this church 9 years ago. That church grew, the inner city maybe grew around that church. Anyway, it already existed, and we planted with purpose. So I was listening to some of your questions about, you know, being downtown versus other places. And it's Father's House is just so unique that sometimes I find myself smiling, because in a sense, I left a big church in the suburbs of the city to come to a smaller place in the inner city where I'm surrounded by lots of activity and lots of people. But in a sense, sometimes I feel like a small town pastor, in that the inner city is a small place with lots packed into it. And so with a lot of the other agencies that are downtown, we know one another, we know the same people. And we go from place to place, so the people come here and they go to the same places. And so in a sense, it's a small world. It's a big world because there is lots of population downtown, but for purposes of ministry, in many ways, it's a small world. But I didn't know that when I came, but I just find it. One of the things that I love about being here, aside from all of the different community drop-in work that we do and the meals that we offer and the services that come through Father's House, still one of my favorite times is Tuesday night when we get out to do our street ministry. And even in the heart of winter, there are people that are still sleeping outside, camping outside. They've made shelters. And one of my staff was laughing about doing street ministry with me, and that he said, you know, we go into these sketchy areas, these places where most people would never even approach at nighttime in the dark. And we go tromping in there where there's some shelters that have been set up. And I call out, anybody hungry, you need a sandwich, need something to eat? And it'll be quiet, there'll be a rustling, and all of a sudden a voice from one of the tents will shout, is that you, Pastor Debbie? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, and little faces will poke out of these shelters in the dark, and a hand will come out of a flap and say, yes, please. And do you have a blanket with you? We're really cold, or whatever. And he's like, it's just crazy how people know you. But that they know me because I've been around long enough. And I never realized when we started this what it would take or how it would work. It was just stepping into a door that God opened. And I'm so glad he's opened the door here in Edmonton for us to do this ministry. One of the things that my mom says I don't describe often enough is that Edmonton Father's House is a church in the inner city, but we are a church of people who come from all over Edmonton to worship here. So while we reach out to our community, we are a church with little children. Yesterday morning, we were still able to do our preschool program, We College, an old Pentecostal program that's been going on for years. And we had our preschoolers here with meeting protocols for COVID, still able to do that thanks to a premier who has allowed us to meet to worship still with restrictions. And so we can fill this place up with kids. And then in the afternoon, we open the doors and we have a whole different group that's coming in. And I just sometimes marvel over the people coming through our door on a daily basis. It just amazes me. And I just see how much God has directed by his Spirit that we're able to do this.
I think when I first started at New Song Church, I planted it here in Windsor 27 years ago. And
happy anniversary.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. when we began, 27 years ago, I think I had probably a greater sense of what I had to bring, the little bit I had to bring, the loaves and the fishes. I had the little boy's lunch, and but I knew I had to share it. And what I discovered was that I've never been bored here in 27 years. I can't get away from it. And I'm learning stuff all the time. And it isn't so much of what I have to give, though that's part of it. Part of the work that we do in urban ministry is gathering the body of Christ around serving and loving our neighbor. But just the ways that I'm constantly learning and receiving from the what I would have thought were the most unlikely people to teach me anything. When you think about church planting in Canada, there's a few exceptions, but it's actually a pretty short line of people that are lining up to plant churches in the city core. It's more likely that church planters will be in the suburbs or outlying communities. And there's reasons for that, right? Parking is usually limited. Real estate is usually ridiculous. And sometimes the bylaws around meeting space and that are just constant hurdles. But if we're going to reach the densest parts of our country in meaningful ways, how are we going to adapt? How are we going to find better ways to be a living presence in our neighborhoods? What would you say to somebody who said, I want to plant a church in downtown fill in the blank city, but it's just too hard. There's too many obstacles. Where would you start? How would you encourage them to lean in, and what's the cost of planting in an urban center? Who's got some thoughts on that? Just pipe in. And there's crickets. Yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
I'll weigh in a little bit. Sometimes I have to work hard almost to put blinders on to focus that God put me here doing this specific ministry, because I am downtown and I do see the high rises, the new places. I mean, I look at our new ICE district in Edmonton. It's just a block or two away, with huge new high rises going up with people that are going to be living there. And I think about there are churches downtown, but many of them are not doing well. And I think, what would I do if I wasn't doing this? How would I reach people there? And when we gathered together in Toronto a couple of years ago, when this team met, and we got a drive through Toronto, and I saw the high rise after high rise. I mean, just a city of high rises. It just overwhelming. I couldn't help but think how there should be a church planted in every building, because of the number of people that live in every building. There could totally be a church. And I was thinking how, if we could just help people to like rent an apartment or rent out a social space in each of those buildings to bring people together, to reach them. And it occurs to me, I know that we think in terms of planting churches, but if we could inspire every believer to be a church planter, if every believer that lives in every area would think in terms of, how can I bring people around? How can I reach the people around me? We would have churches planted everywhere. But I think maybe we're approaching it wrong. We're thinking in terms of the formality of we have to formally plant a church and we have to plan it out. But maybe we should be spending more time investing in every individual believer so that they know that they're all sent and that they all feel that burden of, this is where I am, and there's like 300 people living above me. How can I influence them for Christ?
That could be a Canadian revival.
Yeah.
If every believer saw themselves as, you know, prophets, priests, and kings, queens, as we saw ourselves as servants of the kingdom. Kevin.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Debbie is saying. When I think of the context in Montreal, the city doesn't deliver licenses anymore, permits for people who want to have a place of worship. So if you want to plant a church in Montreal City, you have to either rent another church, rent a church space, or do something in your basement, providing that the city allows you to do that in that specific neighborhood. And I think one of the challenges is that we have this conception of, okay, this is what a church is supposed to look like. You have to have a pulpit, you have to have, seats, you have to have a band, a stage, and everything. But when I think of, I like the story in Acts chapter 2, where it says that the believers gathered, they went every day to the temple, right? And when we read that, normally we think of, okay, so they went to the temple every day to have church, basically. But at the time, they didn't have church buildings. So the Christians would gather in the homes near the water. And when they went to the temple, it was not actually to have church. It was to witness to their, brother Jews that were in the community. So if that was written in 2021, it would have said, well, every day they went downtown, or every day they went to the schools. Why? Because that's where the people were, So basically the church needs to be where people are so that we can witness. And if we can, renew our minds concerning what a church is supposed to look like, we can be more creative and have, like Debbie says, have churches like all over the place, because it doesn't have to be, a building with a cross and a pulpit and everything else that we've been accustomed to.
Yeah, that's good thoughts there. When you look at Paul's missionary journeys in the book of Acts, from Acts 17 through to the end of the book, Paul strategically travels to the urban centers of his time. He travels to Athens. Athens is an intellectual center. He travels to Corinth. It's a commercial center. He travels to Ephesus, a religious city, and to Rome, a political city. And so it seems that as the Spirit was directing Paul to go to these various cities to begin church movements, that there was very much a going to the centers of power and influence in the local context. So when you think about the way that you do church in your city, what are some of the centers of power and influence that you are able to connect to speak to strategically reach? It doesn't take much investigation to realize how different each of our cities are. The thing that probably makes them common are the big box stores, but other than that, every city seems to have its own personality, and there's powers that be in each city. There are values. So talk a bit about that, and in your context, where are the connecting points for you with your ministry to the gatekeepers, the influencers, the power brokers in your city? You want to talk about that? Because church life often we don't usually have churches that are filled with all the doctors and lawyers and influencers. Usually we have salt of the earth kind of people, you know, the common folks like us. So talk a bit about this, your connection to influence in the city.
In Vancouver, we found partnering with the school board has been pretty big for us. We see the school board as gatekeepers, just like Kevan's just mentioned, like going to the schools, building relationships with principals in schools has been absolutely huge for us. We're able to connect with families. Ministry doesn't happen outside of relationship, and so if we can get to a school center, build a relationship with that principal, hundreds of families all travel to that school every single day to drop their kids off. And so if you can get in with a principal at a school and the social workers that know stories of kids' lives, that they give their life to walking with these families, and we start to serve the school by simply going in and saying, hey, how do we serve you? How can we help you? What can we do for you? And we start loving on the school, just kind of focusing our love and attention on that school. We have found it pays massive dividends. It speeds up the relationship of trust with families. We're not asking families to come into our church building with our stained glass windows and stinky pews and all of their preconceived perceptions of the broken church. We're meeting them where they're at, in their school, where they're comfortable. And we're able to offer programs and hear what they have to say. So say, oh, food security is an issue for you? No problem. We're going to get into the space of food security. And we're going to start to provide food hampers. And so that's one thing that the way our congregations responded. We're serving 1,000 families every single week, hampers of fresh food. And so that's one of our call it our outreach arms into the community. And the way we find these families in need, these vulnerable families, is through the school board and through the school systems, meeting with principals. And so that's been just a massive kind of, when you mentioned the word gatekeeper, Kevin, that's what really, it was like, oh yeah, that's right. That relationship was the gatekeeper to access the trust of these families.
Be sure to come back for part 2 of this conversation. And when we come back, we're going to be looking at how we influence the culture of a city. And part of the unique blend that happens in an urban church, where the up-and-comer is sitting side by side with the down and outer, and learning to love all people, learning to serve God together, regardless of our backgrounds. So be sure to come back. And until the next episode, keep one ear to God and one ear to the ground in your city. I'm Kevin Rogers, and this is Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.